In the last session, we looked at different types of profile that you can configure. Let's just review the general profiles you're most likely to be using. Device restrictions that control what it is that users can do. So, for example, you can lock down elements of the user interface and prevent users from running certain features. Email, very common to want to set up an email account so you can automate that process for your users. Endpoint protection, which allows you to configure all of the security-related settings for the particular operating system. And certificates. Certificates are a catch-all for security these days, and the ability to trust a certificate authority, for example, is pretty important. And as I mentioned in the last session, then if you are using an enterprise CA internal certificate authority and you want for your cloud-based users to be able to trust their certificates, it's the very easiest thing to do is to deploy that trusted root certificate to them by using an Intune configuration profile. If you're working in group policy, then you'll want to be able to try to move your group policy settings over from your on-premise environment. You can do that, as I mentioned in an earlier session, by exporting through the use of a backup of a group policy. So if you go into the group policy management console, go to the list of group policy objects, and then select the group policy you want to back up, right-click it, choose the option for backup. Once you've done that, the backup will contain an XML file that contains all of the settings. You can now go to the Intune console and import that. As you can see here, link for import. And once you've imported it, you can then compare what's in the policy, your group policy, with what's possible through MDM. Where you've got settings that it doesn't recognize, you can view those quite easily. So you can see in the summary here that we've got a couple of policies, one for BitLocker and one for IT policy, that are 100% supported. Everything that's done in that group, that collection of group policy settings, can also be done easily in Intune. But there are others, including one labeled the default domain policy. They're all labeled the default domain and policy largely, but one is 56% supported. So there's a few things that we need to look at there and identify how else to get around them. It may be as time passes that these settings are included in Intune. So if you were to rerun the assessment, you might get a different result. But where you can't find a solution, then you sometimes end up having to create a custom profile type, which will allow you to define specifically the setting you want to adjust using a standard way of addressing settings and describing settings. The device configuration profiles you can access through the import ADMX page. If you're migrating from group policy, you can see I've got one here that I've downloaded from the Microsoft website for Outlook. So this is an ADMX file, raw ADMX file that you might typically import straight into your group policy console in an on-prem environment. You can import it here as well. And then you can use this to configure the settings in your administrative templates profile types. So you go to device configurations and you create a new profile for your Windows devices of type administrative templates, and then you should see the settings that you've imported in addition to the default settings. And Microsoft are adding to these all of the time. This has a familiar look and feel to it for anybody who's coming from that group policy environment, and the descriptions and the setting values and the way that the settings work is very familiar to an administrator like me from an on-premise environment. One of the significant advantages in using administrative template profile types is that you can configure many settings, whereas many of the other profile types in Intune configure a single thing, like a Wi-Fi profile or an email profile. They configure exactly what they say they configure. But here you can configure Office settings, Edge settings, control panel settings. There's a range of many settings. So it's much more analogous to the way that group policies work, with the exception, of course, that group policies are linked to containers in an on-prem environment. Here you use group assignments. If you can't do what you need to do in any other way, then you can create a custom profile. It does require knowledge of the syntax of OMA URI settings. And you can see, for example, you need to give the setting a particular specific name and a specific OMA URI path, then specify the appropriate data type and value. In this instance, what we're doing is turning on a setting for Windows devices that requires the user only the private store. Now, the private store is what we call, or had up until recently called, the Microsoft Store for Business. And there is a setting in group policy that you can check that says you'll use the private store for business. That setting never existed in Intune. However, it does now in device restrictions. So it's been added. But at one point, it wasn't possible to do that directly using one of the existing profile types. So a custom profile was used to facilitate it. And that's what we're looking at here. You can also create Scripts, if you can't solve your problem in any other way, or you want to make an ad hoc configuration change, then you can do that with a script as well, and then distribute that in the usual way through Intune. So you browse and locate the script and then configure the settings about how it will run. And then when a user device syncs, it will apply the script and process the script. I'm going to go through a demonstration now and show you how to create a device restriction profile, an administrative template profile, a custom profile, and a script profile. So to create profiles, you go to Devices and then select Configuration Profiles. If you know you're working with a particular operating system, it's possible to go straight to that operating system. So for example, Windows, and then choose Configuration Profiles. And then click Create Profile. Choose the platform, in this case, between Windows 10 and later and Windows 8.1 and later. Then you can choose the profile type. You can choose Settings Catalog or Templates. You've got a range of options here. Administrative templates, delivery optimization, and we talked about all of these in the session, but you'll choose the thing that is required for the given situation. Some of these are very specific, so configuring a Wi-Fi network or VPN settings is doing a specific thing. Deploying a trusted certificate is doing a thing. Whereas some of them, like device restrictions, allow you to configure several things. Let's go with device restrictions first of all. Give it a name, Contoso Dev Res. And then you can go through a range of settings. I don't want to go through all of these, but let's choose, for example, options that are available in Control Panel. Am I going to allow users to access the Settings app? No, I'm not. I'm going to block that. That then blocks everything else by default. But if I say, yes, I am, but I'm going to say that they can't use the system element and the devices element, I can be more specific. Then I can go on and say things like the display settings, general settings for Windows. Can look at messaging options, Microsoft Edge for earlier versions of Microsoft Edge, printer settings, and so on. I don't really want to go into all of them, but the key point here is that there are many settings that you can configure, which makes it quite an attractive option, although you're still linking it to a single group, potentially, but you can at least configure many settings in a single step. And as usual, you then go on to select the groups that you want to assign to. I'm not going to do anything here because I'd rather use policy sets that we discussed earlier. And also remember that you can filter things on the basis of using applicability rules. This is something we've not seen before, but you can specify an applicability that says assign a profile if, and then the property of the operating system edition or operating system version meets a certain value, or don't assign if, depending on what you want to do. And then when you're ready, you can review and create the profile. I'll just abandon that for now. So if you want to look at administrative template policy types or profile types, let's start by taking a look at the local group policy editor, just for comparative purposes really, and expand out administrative templates. Obviously the name is a bit of a clue there. And take a look at Windows components, BitLocker drive encryption, and operating system drives. There are lots of values here, but one that I want to draw your attention to is require additional authentication at startup. And that you can enable it, disable it, or leave it not configured. And then you can specify these options. And there is this descriptive text over here about what each of those options does. And the reason I'm showing you that is I want to show you how you do the equivalent in Intune. So if I'm a group policy user, I'm familiar with that interface, albeit that's a local group policy. So what I want to do is to create a new profile. And this time we're going to choose the type of administrative templates. Give it a name. I call this one BitLocker Demo, because that's what I'm going to show you. And the first thing to notice is that there are many settings that you can configure through here. If I choose Windows Components, so we're under Computer Configuration Windows Components now. If I scroll down, I can find BitLocker Drive Encryption, and then Operating System Drives, and then there's not all the same values here, but there's certainly some of them. And the key one I'm interested in is require additional authentication at startup, and all the same descriptive text. And I can have it enabled, disabled, or not configured. And if I enable it, I've got exactly the same options that look very much the same as they did under group policy. The point I'm making here is not a discussion about BitLocker drive encryption settings, but rather a discussion about how comparatively easy it is to use existing muscle memory to configure settings in Intune with the sort of comparative settings that I've been used to using in group policy. I'll just cancel that and say OK to that. I can then go on to configure scope tags and assignments in the usual way for my particular profile. So let's take a look at creating a custom profile. It's created in much the same way as any of the others. In other words, you start by saying create profile, select the platform, and then choose templates, and then choose custom. Give it a name, demo custom, and then select next. And then you need to add the specific settings. Now, you may not be aware of what those specific settings are. Suppose you've discovered that you can't configure something by using one of the standard templates. So you do an internet search and you determine that there is a way of doing it with OMA URI settings. That will provide, I imagine, the documentation that you need to complete this process. So you select add here, and then you give it the specific name. Script description is optional, but it must be called the specific name of the item that you want to configure. So it might be private store only or whatever it is. So it goes here. Then you define the OMA URI path. Then you choose the data type. Then you set the value of the data. Now I've already got one created, so let's take a look at that. This one actually, private store only, really has no particular meaning anymore because, and as you can see, it conflicts. The way in which I did this with a custom profile is no longer necessary. But anyway, let's take a look at the settings. If we go to, where are we? Oh, there we go. There's the settings. Edit. And then you can see that actually you could have multiple lines in here. So the custom profile, a bit like an administrative template, can address the needs of several areas that you can configure. So I can click add here and add another line. But I just want to have a look at the line that I've created so that you can see what it looks like. So here we have the mandatory name that must be a specific named element in a particular format. Description is optional. Then here is the path. So it's specifying user, vendor, Microsoft, policy, config, application, management, require private store only. So again, that needs to be a very specific path. Then you choose the data type and the value, and you set that. And then you go on and assign it in the usual way. Now, it's not as likely now as it was a couple of years back that you'll be using custom profiles quite so frequently because Microsoft are continually expanding the number of options that are configurable using the standard template types and increasing options to administrative templates as well. So you can do it that way if you're migrating from group policy. So all of that makes things considerably easier. When you can't find any other way to reconfigure a machine and you know that you can possibly do it through a script, then the final thing that you can do here is to configure a script. So once you've created your script, you can add a script in here, Contoso script demo. Browse and select the script that you want, PowerShell script that you want to use, and then specify how it will run. So you run the script using the logged on credentials, enforce a script signature check, and run the script in 64-bit PowerShell host. Those options will depend on what it is that the script does, and whoever wrote the script for you, I suggest you speak with them and try to determine the necessary options here. Once you've gone past this point, you can then assign it in the usual way. So I've got a couple of these. It doesn't really matter what these scripts do, but that's what runs the script against the particular machine that's been targeted. And then you can examine that, whether or not that was successful. Obviously had a bit of a problem here with this particular script. It's failed 3 times, or at least it's failed on 3 devices and hasn't ever succeeded. That's probably because in the nature of the demos that I do, I don't pay a lot of attention to the contents of the script, rather the assignment of the policy or the profile that configures the script. In the demonstration, you learned how to create device restriction profiles, administrative template profiles, custom profiles, and script profiles.